We were very much East Enders. We lived in what was called Cannon Street Road, and my parents were involved in the schmutter industry, as they called it, you know, the manufacturing of clothes and that type of thing. My grandmother lived with us, and she was a very religious person. Cousin living with us. So the East End was a hub for the community, and my house was in particular.
David was a very unusual household because, first of all, they had a house. They rented this house. It was 4 floors, four stories. And there were 11 of them at one time living there after the war, cousins and aunts and uncles. And they had boys' bedrooms and girls' bedrooms. And behind the house, in the sort of yard, was a clothing factory. So the workers all walked through this house to the factory. And David had an uncle who was Down syndrome. And he had a little job in the factory. And they were a very unusual household because David's mother and aunt looked after this uncle. And he outlived the expected lifespan of a Down syndrome person in those days. They were ahead of their time.
And the youth clubs in those days, you had to do activities.
Yes.
And that determined what sort of involvement you would have with the club. We did activities because my parents wanted me to have a shower. We didn't have bathrooms at home. So by going to the club and doing a physical activity, we were able to have a shower. 3 nights a week I would shower at the club, and that was the only form of washing that we did other than going to public baths. The club was also a way of life. We did activities which were compulsory. Most of the boys did physical activities because it was a place where we could learn to play football or do handball or do other activities. Totally a way of life and a place to go. And our parents encouraged us to go because it kept us off the streets. We were able to do a host of different things. The leadership was superb. I was offered a position to go to Liverpool because I was a qualified youth leader, and I was going to go to Liverpool, and then Brady stepped in. I don't know exactly how, and they offered me this post as youth director of Brady clubs. So I went there for a number of years.
It all happened within a week. We were both working at Oxford and St George's as club leaders, and David went to Liverpool for the interview, came back and said, we're moving to Liverpool, we go up this weekend to find somewhere to live. And then Brady phoned. We don't know how they knew, and he went to have an interview, came back and said, no, we're not going to Liverpool, we're going to Brady. Before he became the youth leader, he went to Israel, which was very unusual in those days. He went on what was called Shanat Shurut, which is a year of service, where he was on a kibbutz. And then he stayed in Israel and went on to the youth leaders course called the Machon L'Madrichei Chutz La'aretz, the Institute for Youth Leaders from Abroad, because he was approached by someone in the Israeli government if he would like to do this course. He was one of the first from England to do it. And then the idea is that you come back and you have to work in youth work in London in a Jewish club for 2 years. So that's what he did. And this brought a whole different dynamic to youth work in the East End, because prior to that, Israel really was very rarely mentioned, or the kids really didn't know anything about it. And that's when I met David when he came home. And then a year later, I went on to do the year in Israel. I think it changed the ethos of Oxford and Brady, this Israel input. When we went to Brady, we had shlichim, young youth workers from Israel, come to live and work at the club for a year, and therefore the members got used to mixing with an Israeli person, which was something they had not experienced before. And that was the start of other youngsters going to Israel on different courses. It was the start of them joining summer schemes to go to Israel. Prior to that, really, Israel was never really discussed. What did we know as East End kids? And the leaders conducted a Jewish club. We had services, we had kosher food, but there was no real mention of Israel or what life was like in Israel or what it was. So it was something very, very different. And I think that's how it moved on. That's how it became more modern and more international. I mean, I knew Yogi because I was a Brady girl, and I went several times with Yogi to Switzerland on the holidays abroad. And he used to mentor David as he was an older youth leader, and he used to meet up with David to discuss youth work. So when we followed him, it was like a big football transfer that we came from Oxford and St George's to Brady. But of course we came to this wonderful club that Yogi had created and therefore made our job much easier. Yogi was never far away. He became the youth officer in Islington. So David was always in touch with him as well. And some things we changed because David was so much younger. He was a young leader and came with a different perspective and different experiences. But I think the main thing was that the club was so good to take over.
My attitude and my leadership was completely different from Yogi's. Yogi was a much older person. He did things his way. He had a sort of Germanic background. I was much more liberated in the real sense of the word.
The club was structured in two separate halves, really. David was the youth director, so therefore anything to do with young people came under his umbrella. But we also had the settlement, and we had a warden at that time, Dorrie Cohen, who would look after all that and all the housekeeping, because there was a lot of food and cleaning and everything that had to be taken care of. And part of the settlement was that every day we had a lunch for the old people, the luncheon club. And we had about 100 old people come every day for lunch. We also had services run by Monty Richardson and celebration of all the Jewish holidays run by Monty. For Pesach, Passover, we had a big Seder for mainly the old people in the area. We also had something called the Children's Country Holiday Fund, which was a committee of outsiders that came, and young Jewish people who didn't have a holiday were taken on a holiday to Deal. They had a house there, and this money was raised by another committee that was outside of Brady, but it functioned from Brady. And therefore, when we had any Brady members who couldn't afford camp, the Children's Country Holiday Fund would subsidise them as their holiday. That mainly was the settlement work. The boys' club had the minors, who were the junior clubs, and then the seniors that were really mixed except for certain activities. And the girls' club had a junior club, but we also had a play centre, and they were 5 to 10-year-olds. and they would come in every afternoon from school except Friday. So the club, the minors came in twice a week?
Yeah, I think so.
And the junior girls came in twice a week. The seniors came in 4 nights a week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday. Saturday, nothing happened at the club except when we had services. But Sunday was a very big day at the club. It was very busy. All the football teams would go out. How many football teams did you have?
10, maybe.
And when they all returned from athletics, football, netball, all the different sporting activities, they would all return to the club on the afternoon. The canteen would be open, and of course the place would be filled with young people. And lots of socialising would go on there, eating, drinking. It was a very successful day for the club. And then when everybody had arrived, David would then give all the results of the different matches that everybody had participated in. Very often most Sundays we were open. We would have either a social, which meant that the members were dancing to records, or we would have a dance where they would have a live band, which seems unbelievable now, but we had live bands come. And then everything was run by our voluntary managers. Our managers were a great, great team. 2 teams. We had the girls' managers and the boys. Each had their own chairperson. And each person had their own speciality. And we had Stephen, who was amazing at running the socials and dances. He had wonderful foresight of music and what was going to be the fashion and the fad. And he booked Jimi Hendrix before anyone had heard of him. He booked him to come to Brady. And by the time Jimi Hendrix was due to come, he was the top of what was then called the hit parade, and very successful. And of course, Hendrix's management did try to get out of the contract, but they couldn't. So Jimi Hendrix came to Brady, and any old Brady members now, when they talk about it, other people don't believe them. We could only have so many come in. We were only insured for 300 people in the hall. The whole street outside was filled with young people. It was just packed and throbbing because you could hear the music outside the building. And it was one of the most exciting evenings in the East End. And Jimi Hendrix put on a full show, broke his guitar at the end, was just amazing. So Sunday evenings and Sunday afternoons were very, very busy at the club.
Mainly to Italy, where we would literally take any of the youngsters that were in the club at that time. They had to be 15, 16 years of age, up until 20. That was the age group that we catered for.
David would have to go abroad to find the venue for the holidays. One of the difficult things was that we had to have kosher food. Brady was 100% kosher wherever we were. So when he went to Yugoslavia to look at a place, he met the man there who was in charge of the kitchens, and David said, "We won't be able to eat your meat." And the man said, "Why not?" And David said, "Well, we have our meat killed in a certain way." So the man said, "Tell me how to kill it and I'll do it." But usually the meat was shipped in from somewhere like Milan. He went to Yugoslavia with this club. He took them to Italy. We went to Lake Garda in Italy a few times. Lake Garda, where we stayed, usually we're in youth hostels. Lake Garda, we stayed at the youth hostel, which was attached to the Catholic Church. And when we needed candles for Friday night, they gave us the big candles from the Catholic Church to light for Shabbat candles. And we did find a Jewish family in the town, and they had a sweater shop, a knitwear shop. And we had a relationship with them, and all the kids went there to buy their Italian sweaters. The holidays abroad were as activity-based as the club. And even when we were at the lake, there were swimming races and different competitions. We hired boats, had rowing competitions. And one of the main highlights of the holiday abroad, only the boys were allowed. They went on a 3-day hitchhike. So from Lake Garda, they would hitchhike, and the arrangement was in 3 days' time, we would meet them with the girls. We went on a coach in Venice, where we all met up, and then they would come back to us with us on the coach. And it was a competition, so we had to see which boys arrived in Venice first. And they hitchhiked in pairs or in threes. Yeah, if a member couldn't afford it, then they were subsidised. They were very cheap, the holidays, extremely cheap, and any deficit the club would pick up. And it really did make the members much more worldly. Many of them had never been abroad before and wouldn't have done till they were adults, probably. And it was a very, very unusual activity. Not long after we got there, all youth leaders in the country had to become qualified. Eventually they had to have a degree. But the question was, what would they do with youth leaders that were in the field at the time? So a special course was set up at Morley College to qualify the leaders. And David went on that course with most of the Jewish club leaders at the time. And that, I think, also gave a very modern perspective of leadership. Much more individual, much more discussing and talking with the members, rather than just having them grouped together all the time. When the youth leaders became qualified, clubs were then given local authority grants to pay the leaders' salaries. So of course this was a great help. The non-Jewish clubs, Jewish clubs, everything, they all had paid leaders, paid by the local government. And of course they all liaised together. You know, we had committees in East London where all the club leaders and youth directors would get together. We knew them very well. And we knew the church clubs in South London. I mean, we had a great rapport with them. We all did the same work. Years later, they withdrew the grants. That was the demise of the youth work in this country, because the clubs couldn't afford to pay the leaders. You can't have a committee to raise enough money to run a club and pay the salaries. So gradually the clubs closed throughout the country. And it's been the most dreadful loss. What were the youngsters to do? What is there for them to do? And many schools do the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme, but schools can't take the place of the youth centres. Many years ago we were involved in an anniversary for a club, and someone who didn't know anything about it said, well, what did these clubs do? And it was at the time when there were riots in Hackney with the youth. And when we told him, he said, but if we had those clubs now, we wouldn't have the riots. And that's absolutely true. It kept the kids off the streets, if nothing else. But it also gave them so much more. And now, sometimes they'll open little youth clubs, and the leaders would say to them, well, we'll let you do your music, and that's not what they should be doing. They should be stretching the kids and taking them up mountains and really giving them different activities and expanding their life experience, which they don't have the opportunity to do now.
It was a way of life, you know, both at leadership level and at membership level.
It's a very sentimental memories for us. Both our children were born while we were there, over the road from Brady at the London hospital. And when I had our daughter, our first child, David, came home from the hospital to Brady because we lived in Brady, so we were totally immersed in it. And when he returned to Brady that evening, the members had decorated the club with pink ribbons, and as he walked in, they sang "Thank Heaven for Little Girls."
One day we'll flash and send you crashing through the ceiling.